Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June garden update. I cannot believe that we are nearing the end of June already. It feels like just yesterday I was giving the May garden update, but I thought I would try to get out here relatively early this morning before the heat sets in and show you guys around. It's supposed to be 97 here today, which wouldn't be all that weird if it was August, but it's June, and that's pretty warm for Ohio. So this season continues to just have a crazy mishmash of weather. Now, the garden is in a bit of a transitional period right now. So those cool season crops are all coming to an end, and I'm still going into places with my heat lovers. So you'll see empty spaces, you'll see things like brassicas and peas that are kind of on their last legs, but it just goes to show that the garden is in a constant state of flux. So let's take a look around. And the first thing you might notice if you've seen any of my other gardening tours is that my strawberry bed is almost completely gone. So a lot of these plants were getting fairly old. They were kind of running out of steam. I also had mole tunneling damage under here. So a couple weeks ago, I ran through this whole patch with a mower, heavily mulched, and now I'm using this area for my cucumber trellises. My plan is to go in early this fall when the weather's a little cooler and add some more strawberry plants to this area. And my hope is that the existing plants will continue to send out runners and eventually fill this area back up with new plants. But as I mentioned, for right now, I've got cucumbers planted along this trellis, as well as a few peppers, some zinnias, and some basil that's looking a little sad right now, but hopefully these pop out of it. These cucumbers are looking pretty happy and healthy right now. My plan is to come in and give them a coating with Surround, which is a kale and clay product, with the hopes that that will protect them from cucumber beetle feeding damage. I have not seen any beetles out yet this season, but I know that they should be coming soon, and I definitely want to get ahead of the game with those because they are one of my worst cucurbit pests. In my raised beds up front, I've got a total hodgepodge of things going on in here. A lot of mixed flowers, this lettuce that is now bolting and needs to come out of here, summer squash, and I'm using another tactic here to protect from cucurbit pest, and that is this netting. This will help to protect from squash beetles and squash vine borers, and any other pests that might want to come and lay their eggs on this plant. This netting can be a really effective tactic against these pests. Two things to keep in mind though, you have to rotate your crops, so you don't want to do this where you've grown squash or cucurbits before because the pests can be present in that soil. The other thing is if you're growing a non-parthenocarpic type, so something that is not self-pollinating, the netting will have to come off when these plants start flowering or they will not get pollinated and set fruit. So I've got to get this netting off of here very soon. Now in the back of the garden, I do have some parthenocarpic types planted under netting, which I will keep in place the entire season and see what kind of yields I can get off of those plants. Quite a few carrots in here, and these will size up a little bit more, but they can certainly be picked and eaten right now. And knowing when to pick carrots can be a little tricky just because most of that root growth is under the ground. But in general, I look for those shoulders to be peeking up above the soil a little bit and have some decent size to them. And when I see that, I'll usually pull a few test carrots. And if those are the size that I want, I can go ahead and harvest the majority of the crop. As I mentioned, peas being on their last legs, it is just way too hot for these guys. You can see how the plants are starting to yellow out and they're pretty much finished with production. But this is a really nice variety called Magnolia Blossom. It's a sugar snap pea. And even at this, what I would consider a relatively over mature stage, these are incredibly sweet and tender and crunchy and very, very little string. I've got Morning Call Blue Morning Glory planted over here. This is supposed to be an earlier season version of the traditional Heavenly Blue Morning Glory. So I'm hoping this one comes into flower sooner for me. Another little summer squash, some Chinese 5-color peppers. More carrots. And my poor rhubarb over here, not loving the heat at all. And then some plants that do love the heat, these sweet potatoes back here, they absolutely thrive in these warmer temperatures. And behind me, I had to get a little creative with planting space because I was running out of room for these vining type crops. So I've got some loofah gourds planted in this old tree stump, and they will hopefully climb up and be quite happy on this perimeter fence. In here is another little experiment for me. This is the first time that I've ever tried overwintering potatoes. Now, these guys took so long to emerge in the spring that I had basically counted them for a loss. I thought, oh, they either rotted or voles ate them or something. This is not gonna work. To my surprise, these popped up. They've been growing like crazy. They're putting on flowers now. So I cannot wait until these are ready to dig to see what I've gotten here. And I will definitely be sharing an update of how these do and my whole process of planting and growing these once these plants are harvested and done. In this bed, blackberries are doing fantastic. I've got two varieties in here, Black Magic and Heaven Can Wait, and these are both loaded for fruit. I expect for these to start ripening up probably right around the beginning of July. Not doing so fantastic is my eggplant. Now, flea beetles are typically a problem for me on eggplant, but usually they don't do enough damage as to be detrimental to my plants. This year, it looked like they probably would. So you can see this what they call shot hole pattern damage on these leaves. This is indicative of flea beetle feeding. And what happened is they got out here and got on these plants from the time they were very, very young. They were already dealing with heat stress. And it was very likely that with the pressure from the flea beetle feeding damage that these were going to die. So I really needed to do something to mitigate those effects. So I tried an insecticidal soap. It didn't seem to make a dent. So I upped it up a notch and opted for using Piola, which is a pyrethrin-based insecticide. Now, I generally avoid any kind of sprays, even organic ones on my plants if I can, but in this case, I was truly afraid I was going to lose these eggplant. Now, likely what is going to happen is if I can slow down the flea beetles for a while, allow these plants to get some healthy established growth, I probably won't need to continue spraying. They'll have feeding damage on the leaves, they won't be the prettiest, but the plants will be able to live and be productive. In this bed, we've got more carrots. I've also got a new small space bush bean variety. This is one called Elegance, and it was bred specifically for small spaces. So I've actually got some of these tucked in all these little spots where I had very little room. I've got bulb fennel planted in here. It was a rough spring for bulb fennel, which does not like the heat and does not do well with extreme temperature fluctuations, which is what we've been having. However, this variety called Dragon is very, very tolerant of stress. So I was actually able to get a harvest off of this. Now, speaking of harvesting, I get asked quite a bit what on earth I do with all of this produce that is coming out of my gardens and the gardens at my mom and dad's. Now, multiple families are using the bounty, so me, my parents, my siblings. I also preserve as much as I possibly can. And all of the garden waste, so all the trimmings, all the spent plants at the end of the season, those all get decomposed and composted and added back into the garden in some way. Now, whether it's left on top of the ground as mulch, like these cauliflower leaves, dumped in my lazy compost pile or in one of my outdoor composting bins, or given a jump start on the composting process using the sponsor of today's video, Lomi. I used to just throw all of our compostable materials into a bucket that we kept under the sink in the kitchen, bringing it to the outdoor compost bins when it got full. But as you can imagine, it got pretty gross and stinky. Now I can put all of those scraps into the Lomi and just run a cycle every couple of days. The great thing is running a cycle is as easy as the press of a button, and Lomi has 3 different modes to choose from. Eco Express mode is the quickest option and takes usually 3 to 5 hours to break down waste, reducing volume by up to 80%. The second mode is the Lomi approved mode and takes about 5 to 8 hours to complete. And this is the mode to use to break down Lomi approved bioplastics. And the third mode is the grow mode. It takes about 16 to 20 hours to complete, which is a bit longer to wait. But the cool thing about the grow mode is the end result. So the end result is not compost, but actual nutrient-rich dirt that is full of microbial cultures and organic matter. Great for adding to your plants as is. But what I really love the most is that all of those scraps from the plants that I'm bringing in from the garden and processing, the stuff that the chickens won't eat because I do give a lot to them, that can all go into the Lomi and get broken down in a matter of hours, versus what would take months to a year in my outdoor compost bins. Because again, I'm a lazy composter and I don't do it effectively or efficiently. This really helps me get a jump start on the process. If you are interested in Lomi, be sure to click on the link below to get more information about this revolutionary kitchen appliance. Now, let's get back to the garden. More of a hodgepodge in these beds. I've got some late planted tiara cabbage, my little Ben gooseberry back here, and more potatoes. These are actually a variety called Clancy, and this is a true seed potato that I had started from seed last year. Dug up some of the plants late last summer, but obviously missed some, and now I've got these volunteers coming up. So I'm very interested to see the size of these tubers when I harvest, because last year's Clancy's were relatively small, like about the size of a typical new potato. And more carrots. These, the same, they're not quite all the way sized up, but ready for picking at any time. And in the back, big, beautiful kale. This is Casper. This is a long-standing favorite of mine, and sunboar beside it. And then behind, I've got some moonflowers planted, which are just starting to climb up this fence. But again, I'm hoping by the middle to the end of the season that they'll cover up a large portion of this perimeter fence. Some of my beloved dill here, I use this both as a culinary herb and because beneficial insects like these blooms. More kale. More moonflowers back here to climb this trellis, as well as some yard long beans. This is a variety called Python, which I find has a superior flavor to older yard long bean varieties. I finally have sweet corn planted here. I've typically always planted it at my parents' because there's more room in their gardens, but I'm using this back corner of the garden for sweet corn this year. This corn germinated really well, everything's growing great, but all I can think when I look at this is my poor grandfather is probably turning in his grave at this. He would be so embarrassed of how crooked his granddaughter's corn rows are. I'm guessing that some of you Midwesterners may have had the same experience, but my grandfather was a farmer, and one of his Sunday activities was to drive around in the car very, very slowly and look at all of the neighbors' fields to evaluate how straight their corn rows were. So I'm sorry, Grandpa, but I do have to say I am very, very excited about this variety. You may have heard me mention before in previous videos that I am a trial seed manager. So sometimes I get to look at varieties before they're released to the general market. That's the case with this one. This is supposed to be a red and white sweet corn along the same lines as the wild violet, which I've talked about before. It's one of my favorite sweet corns of all time. This one is supposed to be very, very similar, but with red and white kernels instead of purple and white kernels. So I'm super excited to try this one. Up here in these front beds, again, I've got a mix of kind of everything. And I did have a lot of cool season crops planted in here, so you will see some blank spots. But I tried to go in everywhere with a healthy mix of vegetables, herbs, and annual flowers. Now, as annual flowers go, this one has been a real standout this year. These are more bachelor buttons. This is a variety called Blue Diadem. And I've been so impressed, not only with that gorgeous blue color, but that these plants have remained very, very self-supporting and upright. They have not flopped, even with the relatively strong winds that we've had this season. And just like the other bachelor buttons, the bees absolutely love these. I've been less impressed with this Bronze Beauty Nicotiana. So Nicotiana has been a long-standing favorite for me. I grow jasmine-scented Nicotiana, which is a white-flowered variety, every year, and it has this intense, intoxicating scent. The color on these Bronze Beauties is unique, but the flowers are quite small, and they don't have that amazing scent that the jasmine-scented Nicotiana does. In my next bed over, you'll see a big blank spot here. I just pulled my overwintered onions out, and I had a couple varieties that fared much better than the others. I will pop those up on the screen here. But overall, I was really happy this year. If you watched my overwintering onions video where I showed how I grew them and the harvest of the Winteria variety, I think that year I only got a couple of weeks head start on the harvest. This year I may have gotten even more of a jump start, because if you see my onions in the back, both these that are from seed and these that I planted from starts from Dixondale Farms, it's gonna be a little while before these are ready for harvest. The other thing I tested out was doing a batch of overwintered onions with row covers and without. The batch that did not get a row cover did actually survive, but my bulbs were much smaller and did not fare as well. So I think for the future, I will continue to cover my overwintered onions with a heavyweight row cover. Also in this bed are tomatillos. You can see they're starting to form their little husks already. I have muskmelons planted, and my plan is to have them climb up this trellis back here to save some room. Another of my favorite varieties, this is Kelvin celery. It did really, really well last year and is putting up with the heat quite well this year. And then these are part of my overwintered experiment. So I have a cauliflower here. And other than the slug feeding damage, it's looking pretty healthy, but I just finished harvesting all the heads off of my cauliflower yesterday, and this one hasn't even started to form a head yet. So it will be interesting to see how this turns out. And then up here, I've got some winter sown cabbage. Same thing, pretty healthy other than the slug and the cabbage worm feeding damage, but still quite small, especially when we compare this to the same cabbage variety that was planted out in the garden. And that was started even later than this winter sown stuff. And I've done a couple videos on this winter sowing process so far, and I will be following up with a video comparing all of these varieties as well. So with all my winter sown vegetables and herbs, I did a winter sowing, and I started a batch indoors as I normally would with my normal timing. I've got those all planted out in the garden, and I'm tracking the results of both. So in the end, I hope to have a really nice comparison video. In the next bed, I've got a couple more of my winter sown experiments here. This German chamomile was a clear winner. This far outperformed the batch that I started indoors and transplanted. This kale was also winter sown. This is doing really, really well. It is smaller than the stuff that I started indoors, but I have no complaints with this whatsoever. I've also got a black currant planted in here. This is a variety called Consort. I'm very excited because these fruit are starting to color up. A black currant is definitely a strong flavor. I feel like it's one of those things that you probably either love or hate, but I'm in the love it camp. This Finger Lakes long paste tomato is one I'm very excited about. I have both the long paste and the round planted out this year. These are two varieties from Fruition Seeds that they worked on with Cornell University's breeding program, and these are supposed to have blight resistance and septoria leaf spot, which if you've heard me complain before, septoria leaf spot is one of the top tomato issues that I deal with. So I can't wait to see how these hold up this year. And on this little cucumber trellis, I've got a cucumber variety called Quirk. And this is supposed to be a miniature-sized cucumber that is both resistant to cucumber beetle damage and parthenocarpic. So I'm trying this one out in the open to see how it does resist the cucumber beetles. And then a little bit later, I'm going to start a plant under netting and keep it under netting for the rest of the season and see how the two compare. And in my fourth bed here, you can see I've got borage coming up. All of this is volunteer. Garlic interplanted with beets. I did have some radishes in here, but those all came out. And it is just a sad, sad year for garlic all around this year. It was too wet for too long. These leaves started to yellow early in the season. They've not really gotten any worse, but they've not gotten any better. I suspect that my bulbs will end up being smaller than I prefer, but we have plenty of it planted, so overall I'm not too concerned. So let's check out the back rows. First off, tomatoes. This entire row is determinate tomato varieties, interplanted with basil. And this row I had planted in a spring green manure cover crop. I planted that very early this spring. It consists of oats, winter peas, and hairy vetch. When I was ready to plant the tomatoes, I cut small swatches of it out, just enough to get my tomato transplants in, and I left the remaining areas growing. When those plants had reached optimal growth, so when the peas and the vetch started flowering and the oats were at milky oat stage, I cut down the rest of it. I was able to just leave that on the soil surface as a mulch. And as that has rotted down, I'm coming in with additional mulches. So I've used some of my cauliflower leaves, I'm coming in with leaf mulch, basically anything to cover up this soil surface. Later this summer, when I want to do my second planting of brassicas, I will then come in and be able to plant my transplants between the tomatoes. That will provide them some shade while they get established during the heat of July and August. And then when the tomatoes are done, those brassicas will have full reign of the space. The second row was my cauliflower row, and I just harvested the last of those plants yesterday. I had some really fun colored varieties this year. So a mix of Clementine, which is a vibrant gold orange, Deep Purple, which is a nice deep fuchsia purple color, and then Aerospace, which is a very high quality white cauliflower. I was very worried because with the crazy spring that we had, I didn't think I was going to end up with any cauliflower at all, but I was blown away by how well these varieties did. I've still got kohlrabi and chard back here, which is way overdue for picking, the very last of the peas. And then under this netting is the parthenocarpic summer squash or zucchini that I mentioned. So this should be self-pollinating. It should not require insect pollination. So in theory, I should be able to keep this net over these plants for the entire season, eliminating any kind of squash pest. We'll see how that works. This row was primarily broccoli. All of those plants are coming to an end. So I pulled a few out. In here, I've got some little baby watermelon and this lone volunteer sunflower. A lot of calendula planted in here. And you can see I'm still getting a few nice side shoots off of this broccoli, but I think with this bout in the 90s, most of this stuff is pretty much done. I'm going to be pulling this out very soon and most likely putting a mix of cover crop and maybe some beans in here. Here is that cabbage again, the one that I'm comparing to the overwintered cabbage. And this is the chamomile that I transplanted. Interestingly, this has an entirely different growth habit. So these plants got much taller and lankier as compared to the winter sown plants, even though they're the same seed, which I found very, very interesting. A mix of flowers up here. This is definitely not my color. I do not like this Pepto-Bismol pink, but I will say that this Fire Chief petunia has really, really been a top performer in the garden so far. Straw flowers back here, more zucchini under netting. This is going to have to come off because this is not a parthenocarpic variety. I've got a late planted, supposedly heat tolerant cabbage under this net. My favorite midnight cherry tomato, and beets back here. More fennel that desperately needs picked. Celery and bush beans, marigolds and peppers. And then under this net are some more muskmelons that I just direct sowed. So you can see those little seedlings just starting to pop up now. Same thing, when these plants start to flower, I will take this netting off. I'm just hoping to protect these plants for as long as possible. And in the last row, I've got some pink buckwheat planted in this spot where my cabbage came out. You can see this is a butter stem broccoli, a sprouting broccoli that already has bolted. I really missed the harvest on that. Kale. These were my onions that I started from seed indoors back in January. And then another tomatillo, some watermelon, and some more beets. On the outside of the perimeter fence, I transplanted a bunch of my Jerusalem artichokes from the bed next to the barn. Now these do spread, so I figured this was a decent place to put them. I also have castor beans planted in here. First of all, because I like them. I think they're really neat looking. But second, because supposedly they repel moles. Well, at least in seedling stage, they do nothing because I've had a mole or multiple moles repeatedly digging underneath these and uprooting them. So they're doing nothing to stop the moles at this point. My potato bed is back here. These were the onions I showed you that were started from transplants from Dixondale. And I have these interplanted with apple trees. I mentioned these in an earlier video. I was excited to try these varieties out because they're supposed to be resistant to cedar apple rust. The varieties are Triumph and Liberty, and Triumph is faring the worst. So it is covered with those orange spots that are typical with cedar apple rust. The Liberty is faring quite a bit better. It does have a little bit of spotting, but overall this foliage is looking much better than the Triumph. And then if you happen to be curious about what this ugliness behind me is, I've just got a clear plastic tarp. I am solarizing that patch of lawn because eventually that will be a new piece of garden. On the other side of the garden, the elderberries are taking off. I should have trimmed these early in the spring because there is no way that I am probably going to get to that fruit. So unfortunately, the birds are probably going to have a run of it. Good news is, for those of you who watched my clay soil amendments video, the first part, I did end up getting all of these containers moved. So that is what is under here. I just transplanted sweet potato slips into these containers last night. I've got the shade cloth on them just because it's supposed to get so hot today. I want to give them a chance to get established before exposing them to that intense sun. But I'm really, really happy with that. My husband did end up helping me move these. We only ripped one container, so overall it worked out all right. And then I've got my brand new little garden space up front here. This is another garden space that was created with the help of my chickens. So I kept some of my flock in here over the winter and again allowed them to poop and scratch and do all of their chickeny stuff. They basically killed off all of the grass and weeds in here. Earlier this spring, I was able to move them out and put them into their omelet chicken coop and then transform this into a garden. Now the soil here was not great to begin with. This was very, very compacted because this was an area that got a lot of foot and vehicle traffic. We're starting with clay, so it was not ideal. But after having the chickens in here for that long and then being able to mix in some of the hay and straw that was left over from their bedding, this actually turned out really, really nice. And the plants in here are very happy right now. So the intent for this eventually is to build it into more of a medicinal herb garden space. And I do have some herbs in here now, but I will be adding more this fall and even more this spring. In the meantime, I do have a mix of annual flowers, herbs like chamomile, chives, yarrow, catnip, feverfew, sage, kind of a little bit of everything. And then along this back fence, I've got runner beans. So these are two really nice varieties. These are from a British breeding program. And what they've done is mix traditional runner bean genetics with French filet or gourmet bean genetics. So these are much better at actually setting pods in the heat. They have those beautiful blooms typical of runner beans. So I've got a white variety and a red variety in here. And they have excellent flavor. So I actually have found that I prefer these to my regular snap beans because they are richer, they have kind of a nice meaty texture, really a favorite of mine. And I'm hoping that once this fills up, it'll provide some nice shade from the sun. And this should be a nice little spot to sit and relax. I've got sunflowers and morning glories, more mixed herbs on the back. And then over here, my container cabbages and a big planting of cleome or cleome that's just starting to bloom. And my last little corner over here is a whole assortment of container plantings. I've got my container raspberries, blackberries, quite a few grow tubs filled with potatoes, my blueberries and rhubarb. And I couldn't take it anymore. I had to dump some of these out last night, so I went ahead and harvested my grow tub that had my Baltic rose potatoes in it, as well as my purple Vikings. And these were still quite small. The potatoes would have gotten much larger if I let them grow for a longer period of time. But I was really eager for some potatoes, and I've still got all of these other potato tubs that I'll let reach maturity before harvesting. Well, that wraps up what is going on in my Ohio garden in June. And if you enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna, to catch more garden updates as well as tricks and tips and gardening experiments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.